Hey, Pharmacy Podcast Nation. This is the founder of the Pharmacy Podcast, Todd Urey. I don't get enough opportunity to talk to innovators in healthcare, specifically that have chemistry and pharmacist touch and backgrounds around drug development. And my techie, nerdy self really enjoys talking about artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, the way to use big data actually makes sense that drills down into better patient care because as technologists, I think we tend to want to do things that we think are interesting and put money into them. Lots of venture capitalists 10 years ago were guilty of putting money into something that had no end game. And the
Hmm.
end game is patience. The end game is how do we care better for patients based on all of this technology, regardless of how wonderful we think it is. I want to introduce Dr. Sophia Ononye. Is it Ononye?
Yeah, that's about right. It's Ononye, but you almost got it right.
Yes. She is a born leader. Dr. Sophia is intense. She's curious. She has a tremendous amount of passion and energy. I picked that up immediately from her blogging. She was featured on the WOW podcast, Pharma Voice podcast series, Women of the Week. And I understand she was born in Nigeria and she came to the United States when she was about 17 years old and got involved in life sciences and graduated from Bowling Green State University in the great state of Ohio.
Woohoo!
Got involved in Pfizer and worked as a chemist. And I'm so excited to welcome you, Dr. Sophia, to the Pharmacy Podcast.
Thank you. It's my absolute pleasure. The education bit always makes me smile a little bit because I'm not sure what university I should pay the most homage to because I went to Bowling Green State University, Ohio State University, University of Connecticut, Yale University. But I think the most important thing that my education probably showcases is my absolute craziness for falling in love with chemistry at a very, very young age.
Well, you've made an impact on me because I read a blog that you published on January 21st of this year,
Mhm.
and it's titled The Role of Technology Improving Reputation of the Life Sciences. And I was really kind of touched by the fact that you pulled in the legacy of what was known as the golden age of big pharma,
Mhm.
blockbuster molecular structures becoming medications,
Mhm.
best of class design, the FDA, and then also the impact on pricing. So there's
Right.
lots to unpack with you, and I'm going to jump
Right.
into this because I'm excited to have you. I think it's an honor to have people with your caliber of intelligence who are taking very complex concepts and making it easier to understand for that mid-level healthcare professional who is administrative but also in touch with patients. I think
Right.
merging of that
Right. Right.
organizations that are taking advantage of what you have experienced, it's going to be more palatable to make that touch the patient faster based on providers.
Absolutely.
I want to hear about this. What kind of got you interested in this line specifically, and that is artificial intelligence in life sciences?
Yeah. So the article that you're talking about was one that I published at Cell and Gene, which is an outlet that is also on their Life Science Connect. And they asked me to join as an editorial advisory board member. And I was thinking about 2020. I think there was something that happened to all of us close to the end of last year where we all recognized we're going into a new decade. And my thoughts were, what have we learned from the previous decade that we can apply to the current decade to improve efficiencies across the board? And one of the things that has bothered me, and part of my background is, as you probably alluded to, I was a lab scientist, and I went all the way to Yale as a postdoctoral scientist doing my breast cancer research. When I just kind of got to the point where I'm like, I love science, I hate being in the lab. So, but what can I do with that? And I realized that perhaps my biggest value was the ability to articulate the clinical and economic value of a drug to a diverse audience. So I shocked the world when, well, my little world, not the big world, but I shocked myself when I went back to school for maybe the 20th time at this point to get an MBA. But I think it was a turning point for me because it allowed me to see things perhaps in a different way than ever before. One of the things that I recognized early as a scientist is like 9 out of 10 experiments basically fail. And you come to accept almost that, like, oh, not everything is going to work out. But I never really thought in terms of efficiencies as I did after I got my MBA and I set out my consulting career, where I was like, for each failed experiment, how much does it really cost these companies? Number one. Number two, what is the rollover effect in terms of drug pricing? Because companies have to recover the costs that are lost, the sunk costs essentially. And given the fact that 1 out of 10,000 or so drugs are actually get approved, there's so many dollars that are lost in this process. How do we recover the cost associated with the drug development process? And then I started to think about technologies. What are the emerging technologies around us, whether it's nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, or even social media, for example? How have we utilized these tools that are available to us to make an impact? And so that's perhaps where this article just evolved from that type of thought process, I would say. And you're absolutely right. I touched on a number of different things, but I think the evolution between the 1990s and today, when the pharma industry was pretty much the golden, everyone loved us, right? The golden age of pharma, that's what it's called. But today, unfortunately, you probably know this, the pharma industry is the most hated industry in America. And that says a lot. I think that for the beauty of what we do, for being behind some of the best drugs that are saving people's lives on a daily basis, to being seen as sort of uncaring, I think it came down to the drug prices. I think part of what people are reacting to is like, how does anybody expect a normal person to, you know, pay for these drugs? And so I think I started to think about technologies. If we really tap into artificial intelligence, for example, can we improve efficiencies in terms of how we discover drugs? Can we use more in silico drug design, which is basically computer docking systems? Can we utilize that to improve our efficiencies in terms of drug target interactions early on, right? And if we do that consistently, how many dollars are recovered in this drug development process that will end up with, perhaps lower price tags for these drugs and a higher sort of patient satisfaction and a better reputation for the industry? So I know that's a lot, I mean, to fully digest, but I think the thought processes are just based very simply on how do we improve our efficiencies, and through those efficiencies improve our reputation as an industry. That's really what that article starts to answer.
I'm going to place the link to the blog that Sophia wrote. It was, like I said, it was wonderful because you really took the reader from your understanding of the beginning and now bringing us through higher levels of technology that haven't fully been developed yet in order to develop medications, develop new pharma products. And you even mentioned specific organizations using AI systems that reduce attrition rates through the research and development phase of that medication, and then taking that and learning from it, from constantly going back to the existing information and then predicting how long what the outcome will be going further, which will, I think it's going to lessen that development process. But kind of speak on that, because then I want to jump into some of your ideas around nanotechnology.
Yeah, so I think in October of last year, Novartis had announced a partnership with, basically a collaboration with Microsoft. And the idea is exactly what you mentioned. How do we transform medicine with artificial intelligence? And it starts, for me, it starts with the drug discovery process. That's obviously because it was what I was involved in, and understanding ultimately how those R&D costs connect with the end price tags that people end up reacting to. to. But instead of the context of that is we have AI. You can use it early on, as I mentioned, with in silico drug design to understand screening, etc. You can use it holistically. In fact, there was a great paper that was published in Nature just a couple of weeks ago that was talking about how old drugs are being repurposed. So we're finding new purposes for old drugs. For example, there's a company called Tremor Pharmaceuticals, actually, that is taking Vioxx, which is rofecoxib, which, as you probably remember, was withdrawn from the market voluntarily by Merck back in the 90s, early 2000s, I believe. And today, this pharmaceutical company is bringing back Vioxx, but for the treatment of hemophilic arthropathy, because obviously the hypothesis here is because hemophiliacs, their blood does not clot as well as patients that are non-hemophiliacs. So if you have the issues that we had with Vioxx back in the day was around cardiovascular issues. So now with this patient population, that will not be an issue. So how do we find out about all of these things? That there's, again, a lot of use of computer technology, called it deep machine learning, machine learning, artificial intelligence, whatever the case might be. The ultimate definition of artificial intelligence, I think we're still so many years away from it. But if we understand machine learning at its fundamental, and just the use of computerized systems, period, as a tool to increase the efficiencies in the drug discovery process, by the time we end up at the patient side, AI comes into play as well, because we're talking about personalized medicine, genomics. We have companies that are using a patient's, basically DNA to develop tailored drugs that work specifically for them. These immunotherapies are, of course, going to be very expensive because we don't have a full understanding of it yet. But I think I'm so proud, and for a company like Novartis, for taking that very important first step to say we're very good with science from the aspect of medicinal chemistry, pharmaceutics, pharmacology. We don't claim to be IT or computer geniuses that understand artificial learning as much as you do. If we partner together, how can we improve the innovation in medicines in terms of how quickly we get these drugs, in terms of how efficacious the drugs are, in terms of the safety profile of the drugs, and then thinking primarily access to these drugs and making sure that the sort of the fifth layer of it, which is around the patient genomic information. We're not making broad spectrum drugs that work for everyone, especially when it comes to diseases like cancers, as well as rare diseases, some rare diseases, of course. But I like where the industry is going. And I think these types of collaborations where technology and the life sciences come together will create not the buzzword digital health technology. I don't care about the buzzwords. I care about the fundamental impact it will have on two things, which are drug prices and the overall reputation of the pharmaceutical industry.
So reputation and brand and public perception is a big part of healthcare.
Yes.
And I think pharmaceutical manufacturers have hidden from an aspect of being transparent, not because they're trying to hide anything, but because of the legalities that the world has placed on the developers, and they can become a lawsuit for just about anything.
Right.
And so they've hidden from the social media, they've hidden from publishing, and now I'm seeing them come from behind that shroud of secrecy, per se.
Yes.
We're seeing organizations like Eli Lilly, who actually came on the Pharmacy Podcast Network to talk in depth for type 2 diabetes in seniors. And they employed a Dr. Scott Drab from UPMC to really talk in depth about a specific medication that they've designed to target seniors with serious type 2 diabetes in care settings where the patient might not be as mobile, or they might not be as living a freedom-oriented life because they're very sick. So when I see pharma companies doing those things, I see things changing from the perception of big pharma as these gargantuan cold companies that all they want to do is make a dollar, and they're starting to humanize themselves.
Right.
Another aspect of the pharma industry that I think is misguiding is the pharmacy benefit managers play an enormous part of the expense of our. and they are the ninjas, the hidden pieces of this. Nobody, unless you're in the industry, and even people that are in the industry, the Pharmacy Podcast Network just put out a poll on Twitter, and we
Mm,
have 22,000 followers, and I was very disappointed. We only got 46 replies, and the
mm,
question was, how well do you know what a PBM is and what a PBM does?
mm, mm,
And
mm.
most of those people that responded say, we have no idea. Well, how can we expect a patient to understand what a pharmacy benefit manager does, what they're supposed to do, and what they're not doing, except for charging Medicaid systems that are now being audited? Pennsylvania State's going to be auditing. Arkansas is going through some auditing. Florida State Medicaid will be auditing. All of these is going to unravel that, which will help the pharma company come out and say, hey, listen, it's not just us. We're not the ones imposing these costs on the public. There's other things that play into this. But when I read your article, you were telling me that there's a time now in our industry to really grab the public's attention by
Yes,
being transparent, by
yes,
giving data, and
yes,
the way to minimize the this outlandish thought of, once again, the cold pharma company to be prolific and to be pushing of data out to the public, to let them know, here's what we do to develop a,
right,
make
right,
it simple for the non pharmacy and pharmaceutical industry people to understand what's really what goes into this, which
right.
back to you touching on artificial intelligence. I want
Mm-hmm,
to understand from your perspective, how do you see today artificial intelligence helping in drug development? Number one. Number,
mm-hmm.
where do you imagine that could go based on what we know today?
So I think I mentioned it earlier. It's really around the drug discovery process. I mean, I think that that's probably where, if there's an area where you can really pinpoint where artificial intelligence can be helpful. It's about making sure from the start that we have precise drug target interactions. So even though biologics, which as you know are large molecules, a lot of the new cancer therapies tend to be biologics, and one was Kymriah, which was approved by the FDA a couple of years ago, and it had a price tag of roughly $475,000. But my point is, when it comes to drug development, 60% of drugs are still small molecules. And so some of the traditional practices where you keep running experiments to see how it goes, it's become fairly antiquated. It's a little bit old now. So what we need to think about is, how do we leverage AI with in silico docking, for example, or just thinking holistically about what are the right types of drug target interactions. Another example is screening through old drugs. And I mentioned the Nature article that really did a deep dive analysis on how we can repurpose old drugs. So that's one area. But the idea, of course, is if we can reduce the costs that are associated with drug development, then it makes it cheaper for patients to get these drugs. And to answer your second question around how all of this sort of ties together, I think that, I mentioned nanotechnology as well in the article, and nanotechnology is very important for the pharmaceutics side. I'm sorry, do you hear that?
Slightly.
Oh, I'm sorry, it's the New York City life. But I think technologies play such an important role. AI probably early on in the drug discovery process, not that it doesn't have a role later on when it comes to how we recruit patients for clinical studies. I think that's a very pivotal point, because if we can leverage a patient's genomic information and utilize it during clinical studies, we can make sure that we're maximizing efficacy and safety profiles during the drug discovery process itself. Because after the drugs get approved, even though they go through a post-marketing surveillance or so-called phase 4 of drug development, the drugs are already out there. So how can we improve efficiencies before the drugs actually get approved? First at the sort of early on in vitro, in vivo stage, and then once we start getting these drugs in humans, to make sure that we can also utilize their genomic information to tailor the medicines, right, to patients. But ultimately, I also think about technology around simple things like, if you're a pharmaceutical company, when was the last time you took a look at your YouTube video to ask yourself how much of it is just based on pure education? To say, oh, myasthenia gravis, we're developing a drug for this. Do you know what myasthenia gravis means? Or this is the mechanism of action of our drug. I will show you pictures, I'll show you videos, I will try to engage. YouTube is the second most used search engine outside of Google. And the pharmaceutical industry ranks the bottom for how it uses YouTube relative to other industries. And that's probably something that we ought to keep in mind as well, that we live in an age of transparency. And back in the day, you can be in the dark, come out, oh, we have a new drug, everybody cheers, woohoo. But in today's world, patients need to know, even if a clinical study fails, it's okay, we can share that information. But I think we've become so sensitive about maybe fluctuations in stock prices, for example, or if we say that, what is it going to do to our stock price? And I'm not trying to diminish the importance of money, but I think ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, we all patients and caregivers at some stage or the other. And if we don't pay attention to these issues, they might affect us when it's too late. So there has to be a consciousness to improve transparencies, to look at collaborations within the industry, outside of the industry, and to think holistically about what we can do to increase patient awareness and patient knowledge of what the industry does. Because until we sort of unfold that, there's always going to be a little bit of a barrier between what the industry is doing and what people think they're actually doing.
Yes, and the word marketing is ultimately another word for the word communication.
Yes.
If the bio companies and pharma companies would develop, like you said, some videos that they throw out on YouTube, and they connect to Twitter and they connect to Facebook, and they show people, hey, here's a infographic, or here's a video showing how our drug has been developed and what mistakes we've made. People love to see big organizations admit that they've made mistakes, hear how things have been corrected, here's what we're doing in the future, and oh, by the way, here's why the medications cost as much as
Right.
initially until they
Right.
go generic. And then here's how that affects your health, and here's how it affects your income, and here's how it affects your insurance. And Sophia, I completely agree with you.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to say they don't do that already. They do that to an extent, but I think there's so much room for improvement, and we ought to be able to have a dialogue. I think this is an industry that brings in life-saving therapies. I mean, that's a powerful statement in itself, that everything I do, for example, is to make sure that people know more about the companies that I support. And part of that is that if you know what they really did, then I think there'll be so much more respect for what the industry does. And I think there's going to be a sort of a follow-on article to this article that we're discussing, that I'll be publishing in Life Science Leader, and it's around value communications, which is really the art and science of articulating what I mentioned earlier, the clinical and economic value, in such a way that all stakeholders are informed of what a company really does. And I think in the life science industry, it's never been so important to talk about all those different things. I mean, we talked about pharmacy benefit managers. Most people, if you say Express Script, they don't know what that really is. But what role do they play? We know now that Amazon, Google, and some of these technology companies are going to play a bigger and bigger role in healthcare. How are we partnering with them to ensure that sort of exchange of information to come up with better solutions than what we currently have? I think the competition model where every new market entrant is a competitor, I think that that's a little bit outdated. Starting with this collaboration with Novartis and Microsoft, I think there's so much room for improvement for us to see many more of these collaborations that are really aimed at whatever we can do to improve patients' lives. That's the most important part.
It's amazing that you say that, because there's so much attention around women in the sciences, STEM, in how science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and the arts are playing a bigger role now in advancing the lives and the careers of women in
Yes.
pharmacy. You've been
Yes.
honored in that with several interviews that you've done.
Yes.
I have 4 daughters, so empowerment. I'm obviously their biggest cheerleader. But I think that that's an aspect of healthcare in of itself. The Pharmacy Podcast Network partnered with Dr. Susie Solomon. She started the Women in Pharmacist or Mums in Pharmacist group, really talking about how mothers that are in full-time healthcare careers have some interesting obstacles that they may not face in other roles, and being on their feet as pharmacists and
Yeah. Yeah.
breastfeeding and other things. But I think that understanding that in of itself is going to set the domino effect for the future generations, where we won't be talking about it in 10 or 20 years, where it won't even be a thing, which
I hope so.
I hope in my being naive that we don't have to, be advocates for that. It should just be.
I wish you're very optimistic. My timeline is a little bit longer than yours, but I think I do agree with you on one point, which is around persistence. I was born in Nigeria, as you mentioned, and I had this vision about who I wanted to be by the time I was 6 or 7. I was reading the Encyclopedia Britannica for fun. I was just that curious about everything. But I also grew up in a society that was fairly male dominated. And I think my role as a woman was already mapped out for me. I was going to be a mom and I was going to be a wife. And I was like, I don't have an issue with that per se, but what if I wanted to be something else in addition to those? Do I really have a choice? And my dad made it clear that I didn't really have much of a choice. So coming to America for me was the ultimate definition of liberation, and working my way through, very humble beginnings in Bowling Green, Ohio, to where I am now in New York City. I think that if that's not the definition of an American dream, I don't know what is.
Right.
But I had to fight a fight. And I'm not just a woman, I'm also a woman of color, and then I'm an immigrant, and I have an accent. I have all these things that is like, Jesus, you are so different. But I also learned to almost take it with a sense of humor, but to almost expect what people will think. I tweeted about this at the end of last year, and I got close to 2,000 likes, which was a little bit crazy. But I was asked by one of my advisors to actually drop my PhD, and to not mention I did a postdoctoral fellowship at Yale because people will be intimidated. And I was like, well, I'm not going to do that. And if you don't want to advise me, I don't think you're actually the right type of advisor. So no, I'm not going to take away my title or the degrees that I work so hard and sacrifice so much for, so that people can be comfortable. And how do we define comfortable? So a woman being educated is going to make people uncomfortable, and this is 2019 and it's in the US that I'm having this conversation, and this is from a US man. So I think that just that trajectory, that full circle, made me recognize that we still have a lot of challenges that we're going to be facing as women in science, and that's not going to go away anytime soon. However, if you have an opportunity to amplify your voice and to maybe serve as an inspiration to other people, then you can generate more of a surround sound through the work that you do versus just what you say. And that's part of what I believe quite strongly. And to be in a position where some of the girls I went to high school with in Nigeria, like, I'm going to go to school now. I might get a master's degree. I might, get a job. I might, whatever the case might be. Even if it's here in the US, there are so many women that like to know that there's someone else that has done this. But my goal is to inspire people regardless of their gender, their background, or anything of that sort, because the dream is a dream. And my dream, I became a reality, but it only did that because I worked extremely hard for it. And I was fortunate to be blessed at very special stages in my life, the right type of people who provided me with their experience and knowledge that I needed to get to the next level. Now, it doesn't mean that it was always pleasant, but I'm in a stage now where I can decipher what is good and what is not good. So I know bad advice when I hear it, and I'm not going to give up my PhD anytime soon.
Absolutely. No way. What's amazing though, is something I picked up from even meeting you electronically. We got to meet in person someday. Is that you do things through a sense of hope, and you do things through a sense of positivity. You're not
Yeah.
doing this through negativity. Even
Yeah.
though you receive those kinds of backlash, even though you've been given those obstacles, you're not
Yes.
doing it as a conundrum. You're not doing it as someone who's angry. You're doing it with joy, and you're doing
Yes.
it with servant leader.
Yes.
And that brings more respect from me to you
Oh.
in how you've presented yourself. And I love that. I absolutely love that. That's the kind of women I want my
Thank you so much. Just real quick, I was given a Spark Award by the Healthcare Business Women's Association, and that was just because of my dedication to volunteering. So that attitude of servitude to support others, to help others out, is something that I believe very strongly about. And my joy is really how I get my strength. I think that you give so much to the world with a smile, and even when you don't feel your best, I think that that's what makes you the bravest. Now, I do feel my best today, so I'm sure I'm extra joyful. So, yay.
You brought that. So we have a video component of this that we're going to throw up on YouTube, but we also have the majority of our content is all audio, but I'm sure people can hear your smile just as they can see your smile.
Now, if I knew I was going to be on YouTube, I would have found a camera crew or something like that, to have the right light, but maybe next time.
I think there's an authenticity to all of this that I think is also nice in social media today. So nothing has to be perfect at all times.
Yes, yes.
Well, I have to thank you for coming on the Pharmacy Podcast Network. We go out to about 75,000 listeners total in 127 countries. And we're working everything we can do to elevate the ideas and innovation of pharmacists throughout the country and how important they are. I believe they're the hub of healthcare and the way that they can execute on therapies in collaboration with primary care and physicians and technologists and research. And I have to just say right now, we have to have you back at some point.
Well, you know how to get in touch with me. It will be an absolute pleasure. I'm honored by what you do, and I hope to, add a different flavor to it, because that's what makes this so interesting.
That's right. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, and we look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.